Hey everybody, this is Adam B. Levine from Let's Talk Bitcoin. We had so many new show submissions for the contest, we've opted to create a page where you can listen to all of them at your own pace. Visit letstalkbitcoin.com/contest to peruse the entire set, and feel free to vote for more than one. We'll be selecting multiple shows to join the network in Q1. Enjoy the show, and remember to vote at letstalkbitcoin.com/contest.
Hello, welcome to the very first podcast episode of The Present Case. My name is Sean Colgan, and I'll be your host as we explore the fascinating world of Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies, related technologies, and the law. Bitcoin may be old news to many of you, but it's brand new in the eyes of the law. That means there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot to discuss. Lawmakers around the world are just starting to grapple with how to respond to Bitcoin. If this podcast lasts more than one episode, which, let's face it, doesn't seem very likely, but if it does, we'll take a broad, many-faceted look at the potential future legal and regulatory landscape for Bitcoin and digital currency. My hope is that this podcast will provide some entertainment value for people who enjoy kicking around this kind of thing, and may even be intermittently useful to those in the Bitcoin community. I do have to say, though, that just because I'm talking and just because you're listening, that doesn't mean that I'm your lawyer. And the only advice I can give you is that you should not, never, ever treat anything you hear on a podcast as legal advice. I mean, I don't really have to say that, right? But, okay, I just said it anyway. So let's get started. Today, we're going to stay out of the nitty-gritty of regulatory compliance and tackle a very broad question. One of the first questions, in fact, that people often ask when they first get a handle on how Bitcoin works. And that question is, hey, is that legal? Meaning, is it legal to buy and sell stuff with this Bitcoin? Is it legal to use a privately issued currency? Now, we're not talking about regulation here. Tax law, for instance, obviously has something to say about Bitcoin use, and we'll be sure to tackle that fascinating topic in a future podcast. Money laundering regs are a big topic too, and we'll get to that someday. But those issues concern laws and regulations directed at how Bitcoin is used. For instance, is it being used to avoid paying taxes, or in such a way that money laundering activity could be hidden? Today we're after a more general, higher-level question, which is whether Bitcoin use is illegal regardless of how it's used. In other words, if Bitcoin is used in compliance with all existing regs, and for an otherwise 100% legal purpose, is it still illegal? Now, maybe that sounds like a silly question to you. After all, if it's not legal, then why isn't the US government prosecuting people and shutting down major players like BitPay or Coinbase? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that question could very well be that the government isn't acting because it doesn't see Bitcoin as a threat, not because it doesn't believe that it lacks the authority to do so. But what if the government did start to see Bitcoin use as a threat? What if, tomorrow, the government decided that it wanted to crack down on Bitcoin use? Could it do it? Are there laws already on the books that could be interpreted as making Bitcoin use illegal? Is the government likely to try and use laws already on the books to make Bitcoin illegal? This is a vitally important question. Under ex post facto laws, governments can't retroactively criminalize activity that took place before a new law was passed. So, if the US government passed a law tomorrow making it illegal to buy or sell Bitcoins, for instance, you couldn't be charged with a violation of that law until after it went into effect. But if criminal prosecutors took the position that current laws already make Bitcoin use illegal, then those could be enforced with respect to any Bitcoin activities, regardless of when they took place. Before we get started, however, I need to apologize to any listeners from outside the United States, because while Bitcoin is international in scope, this podcast, sadly, is not. At least initially, I'll be focusing solely on law and regulation in the United States. Sorry about that. If things go well, I hope to get some Bitcoin watchers in other countries on the show, but for now, we'll be keeping it close to home, which for me is Seattle, Washington. Okay, back to the topic at hand. I'm going to start by reading a quote from an FBI press release in 2011. This quote had to do with the Liberty Dollar case, which maybe you're familiar with. Liberty Dollars were gold and silver coins privately issued by an organization called NORFED, the National Organization to Repeal the Federal Reserve. In 2011, the founder of NORFED was tried and convicted of criminal counts of conspiracy and counterfeiting. After the conviction, the FBI released a press release in which it stated the following. Quote, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 of the United States Constitution delegates to Congress the power to coin money and to regulate the value thereof. This power was delegated to Congress in order to establish and preserve a uniform standard of value, and to ensure a single monetary system for all purchases and debts in the United States, public and private. Along with the power to coin money, Congress has the concurrent power to restrain the circulation of money, which is not issued under its own authority, in order to protect and preserve the constitutional currency for the benefit of all citizens of the nation. It is a violation of federal law for individuals or organizations to create private coin or currency systems to compete with the official coinage and currency of the United States. Now, that statement wasn't made with respect to Bitcoin, but the final sentence is potentially ominous for Bitcoin users and entrepreneurs. I'll read it again. It says, "It is a violation of federal law for individuals to create private currency systems to compete with the official currency of the United States." So, what is the FBI referring to here? What federal law are they talking about, or are they just completely off their rocker? Well, let's start with the Constitution. The FBI refers to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. That provision states that Congress has the power, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Now, here's where we need to make a short detour into U.S. constitutional and Supreme Court history. But I promise it'll be worth it, and as you'll see, it's actually quite relevant to what's going on today. Strange as it may sound, Civil War-era jurisprudence has a lot to say about the potential future of Bitcoin. Let's start by taking a look at that provision of the Constitution we just read. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 gives Congress the power to, quote, coin money. You might wonder whether that means that the government can only issue actual coins, and in fact, that is what it means, or rather, that's what it meant when those words were drafted in 1787. Looking at historical sources and the British common law against which the Constitution was written, it's pretty clear the founders intended to give Congress the power to mint coins and to determine the official metal content of those coins. And in fact, that's exactly what the first Congress did, when it established the silver dollar as the unit of money for the United States and fixed its metallic content at a certain number of grains of pure silver. Paper money, the things we carry around in our pockets today, didn't start being issued by the United States until the Legal Tender Act of 1862. That was right at the start of the Civil War, and the government had discovered that it needed money. Congress at that time was just the Congress of the North and essentially a one-party system. It passed the Legal Tender Act, which authorized the printing of new United States notes that became known as greenbacks, and made them legal tender for all public and private debts, meaning that creditors, by law, had to accept payment in the form of greenbacks. The new money, however, quickly depreciated, and creditors began refusing to accept greenbacks in payment. The result was a series of court cases that reached the U.S. Supreme Court, the so-called legal tender cases. The first of these was Hepburn v. Griswold, which was decided in 1870. By then, the war was over, and the greenbacks issue was subject to a sharp political divide. The government had been left with a large public debt at the end of the war, and there was debate about whether to issue more greenbacks to pay it off, or to return to a gold standard currency. The Democrats of the time, in general, were hard money proponents, and the Republicans were generally in favor of greenbacks. Before the issue reached the Supreme Court, there had been a number of state court and lower federal court decisions, some holding that greenbacks were constitutional, and some holding that they were not. When the Hepburn case was decided, there were 8 justices sitting on the Supreme Court, 5 Democrats and 3 Republicans. The court decided by a 5-3 margin, with all the Democrats voting in the majority, and all the Republicans voting in the minority, that the Legal Tender Act was unconstitutional, and that creditors could refuse to accept greenbacks, at least with respect to debts that had been incurred before their first issuance. The president at that time, however, was a Republican, Ulysses S. Grant, and as it happened, there were 2 vacancies to be filled on the court, one for a retiring Democratic judge and one new seat. Grant quickly appointed 2 Republicans, and the 5-judge Republican majority voted to take up another case raising the same issue, which was decided the following year. This was the case of Knox v. Lee, in which the court, by a 5-4 vote, with all the Republicans voting with the majority and all the Democrats voting with the minority, reversed Hepburn and held the Legal Tender Act to be constitutional. The majority decision was authored by Justice William Strong, one of the newly appointed Grant Justices. The Strong opinion was not a model of sound judicial reasoning. He wrote, quote, "To assert that the clause enabling Congress to coin money and regulate its value tacitly implies a denial of all other power over the currency of the nation is an attempt to introduce a new rule of construction against the solemn decisions of this court. So far from it containing a lurking prohibition, many have thought it was intended to confer upon Congress that general power over the currency, which has always been an acknowledged attribute of sovereignty in every other civilized nation than our own." The remarkable thing about Strong's reasoning is that it completely ignores the Bill of Rights, and in particular the 10th Amendment, which states that powers not given to the federal government are specifically reserved to the states and to the people. Strong rejects the idea that the clause enabling Congress to coin money contains a tacit denial of all other power over the currency of the nation, but in fact, that's exactly what it implies. That's exactly what the 10th Amendment requires. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court had held that the Constitution gave Congress a, quote, general power over currency, and Congress, from that day to this, has never looked back. Now, let's take a look at a couple of the laws Congress has passed pursuant to that dubious authority. Two sets of laws are of particular interest to the current topic. First, there is the Stamp Payments Act of 1862, and second, the various laws against counterfeiting that Congress has passed. We'll start with the Stamp Payments Act. A literal reading of the Act suggests that the issuance of bitcoins could be considered a federal crime, punishable by jail time. It provides as follows. Quote, "Whoever makes, issues, circulates, or pays out any note, check, memorandum, token, or other obligation for a less sum than $1 intended to circulate as money, or to be received or used in lieu of lawful money of the United States, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 6 months, or both." The Stamp Payments Act came out of the same monetary debacle of the greenbacks that we were just discussing. Greenbacks were a fiat currency, and they started depreciating against gold and silver almost immediately. The result was that silver coins became an object of speculation and started to be taken out of circulation. By July of 1962, there were practically no fractional coins remaining in circulation. Private individuals began issuing small paper notes in denominations from 5 to 50 cents, promises to pay of hotels, restaurants, and other businesses. These were the so-called shin plasters. Congress responded with the Stamp Payments Act, which outlawed the issuance of these small denomination private currencies, and started issuing its own small denomination paper monies, first in the form of postage stamps. The result is the Stamp Payments Act, which is still on the books, and which makes it illegal to issue, circulate, or pay out a note, check, memorandum, or token in sums less than $1 intended to circulate as money. Although the Stamp Payments Act has not been used in over 100 years, it's still on the books today. And that means that anybody issuing, circulating, or paying out any, quote, token, which is not a defined term, or obligation for a sum less than $1 is potentially subject to prosecution under the Act. Bitcoins are divisible to 8 decimal places, and therefore can be issued, circulated, or paid out in sums less than $1. Now, if the Act was just limited to issuers, well, then no problem. Good luck finding the issuer of Bitcoin. But the Act also issues the act of circulating or paying out notes, checks, memorandums, tokens, or other obligations. So again, given a literal reading, the Stamp Payments Act could be used to criminalize Bitcoin activity. The best protection, probably, is that the Stamp Payments Act was passed over 100 years ago and clearly never had anything like Bitcoin in mind. But can we rule it out? No, not entirely. We'll come back to this at the end. The other legal framework potentially at issue are the counterfeiting statutes. Unlike the Stamp Payments Act, the counterfeiting statutes have been the subject of recent U.S. prosecutorial action. And this is where we get back to Norfed and the story of Liberty Dollars and the FBI quote that I read at the beginning. Norfed used its own private mint to produce and circulate gold and silver coins, as well as dollar bills that were backed by gold. The currency produced by Norfed, however, was not an exact copy. The dollars didn't look like US dollars, and the coins were different sizes and had different images on them. Nevertheless, they contained images such as the Statue of Liberty and could conceivably be confused by members of the public. Under the statute, however, private currency doesn't have to be an exact copy to be subject to criminal prosecution. 18 U.S.C. 486 states, "Whoever, except as authorized by law, makes or utters or passes, or attempts to utter or pass, any coins of gold or silver or other metal intended for use as current money, whether in the resemblance of coins of the United States or of foreign countries, or of original design, shall be fined under this title, or imprisoned not more than 5 years, or both." The counterfeiting statutes thus suggest that not only fake money is criminalized, but also privately issued competing money that could impact the monetary policy of the U.S. In any event, the FBI went after the founder of Liberty Coin, and he was convicted of conspiracy and 2 counts of counterfeiting. Afterwards, the FBI released the press release that I quoted up front. Quote, "It is a violation of federal law for individuals or organizations such as Norfed to create private coin or currency systems to compete with the official coinage and currency of the United States." In other words, it's not just illegal to make coins that look like US dollars. It's illegal to make any private currency that competes with US dollars. So, is the FBI right? Is the mere issuance of private currency illegal activity under the counterfeiting statutes, even if it bears no resemblance to US legal tender? Well, probably not. The Liberty dollars used symbols and phrases that were evocative of US monetary Federal Reserve notes. And prior to the prosecution, the U.S. Mint released a notice stating that there was potential confusion among consumers. Nobody is ever going to confuse bitcoins with US dollars. Nevertheless, the language in the statute could conceivably be applied to bitcoins. And even though it refers to coins of gold or silver or other metal, that kind of distinction could be ignored by a court that instead would focus on the use of Bitcoin as a currency. It should be clear by now, however, that both of these statutory schemes are a stretch. Neither the Stamp Payments Act nor the counterfeiting statutes were passed with Bitcoin in mind, and neither is directly applicable in terms of the intent behind the original statutes. Nevertheless, as Congress faces up to the issue of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but mostly Bitcoin, it essentially has 2 choices. 1, it can attempt to pass a new set of laws imposing a comprehensive legal scheme for cryptocurrencies. Or 2, it can use what it already has on the books. The problem with the first approach is that trying to pass a new comprehensive scheme governing Bitcoin is going to move so slowly, but that by the time it's passed, the economy has moved on. Indeed, new technologies could make a scheme obsolete almost overnight. Also, what we're talking about here today is the possible criminalization of Bitcoin activity, and if that happens, it's liable to happen very quickly in response to economic conditions. For example, it's not hard to imagine a scenario in the not-too-distant future when the US dollar starts to depreciate and depreciate fast, perhaps in response to a new financial crisis, or in response to reckless monetary policy that tips the currency into hyperinflation. If, by the time something like that happens, Bitcoin usage and awareness has spread to such a degree that people can quickly move their money and their savings into Bitcoins, then that's exactly what they'll do. In fact, it need not even be U.S. citizens who start moving their money. The U.S. dollar is held as a reserve currency all around the world, and Bitcoin adoption is moving much faster in countries that are used to currency depreciations than it is here. In other words, Bitcoin could help fuel a run on the dollar. And if that were to happen, you can bet the U.S. government would take measures quickly, and they would be extreme measures, and they would have to use the existing laws on the books. And in that light, in the light of that type of scenario, it's not inconceivable that something like the Stamp Payments Act or the counterfeiting statute would look like a good option. The problem isn't that there are laws on the books already clearly criminalizing something like Bitcoin. The problem is that there aren't laws on the books protecting people who use private currency. Thanks to Strong and the politics of the time, Congress has a virtually unlimited authority to control currency in the jurisdiction of the United States. And that includes private currencies. So far, the government has looked the other way, likely because it doesn't see Bitcoin as any kind of serious threat to U.S. monetary policy. The actions we've seen so far haven't had to do with Bitcoin so much as they've had to do with violations of other laws. For instance, when the FBI took down Silk Road, they weren't going after Bitcoin so much as they were going after illegal drug use. And when the Department of Homeland Security seized funds from Mt. Gox, they weren't going after Bitcoin exchanges so much as they were going after activity that could potentially be used to hide money laundering activity. Our question today, as we stated at the outset, is whether the government could go after Bitcoin use that is otherwise 100% in compliance with U.S. law. Unfortunately, the answer to that question is yes, it could. The best defense against that kind of activity, ironically, may be to push forward the Bitcoin economy. The faster, the better. If Bitcoin usage grows to such an extent that it's integrated and known and perceived as safe, it would become politically impossible, or at least very unpalatable, for the United States to crack down on Bitcoin, even in the event of a hyperinflationary scenario. Now, it may very well be that the future of Bitcoin gets written outside the United States and its heavy regulatory structure. It may equally be the case, though, that Bitcoin gets driven forward by activities and capital investment in the United States as much or more than anywhere else. My hope is that Bitcoin pushes forward everywhere. And as we've seen today, the faster and the sooner, the better. So that about wraps it up for today. Thanks for listening, and a big thanks to Let's Talk Bitcoin and Adam B. Levine for making this opportunity available. I certainly don't envy you having to listen to dozens, who knows, perhaps hundreds, of first-time podcasts like this one. But I have to say, I think it's a great idea. Just speaking for myself, I was inspired by the opportunity to try something that I wouldn't have otherwise tried, just because the opportunity was there. You know, kind of like Bitcoin. Until next time, this has been your host, Sean Colgan.
If you enjoyed the show you just listened to, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/contest and send 0.1 millibit or 0.0001 Bitcoin to the address indicated for that show. Thanks for helping.